MS-13, and many other gangs. These are animals. These aren't people.
How many people's lives have you ended? 5 or 10? How many?
More than 50.
The first thing I noticed when I stepped inside CECOT was that nobody seemed to be looking for a way out. Around me were rows of men packed behind steel bars, many of them accused or convicted gang members from groups that had spent years turning parts of El Salvador into territories ruled by fear. Some belonged to MS-13. Others came from Barrio 18. Outside these walls, those rival identities had fueled brutal conflict. But inside CECOT, none of that seemed to matter anymore. What shocked me most was not simply the number of prisoners. It was the realization that, for many of them, the outside world had already become something they could no longer reach. Every part of the prison appeared designed around one message. This place was built to remove dangerous men from society and make escape almost unimaginable. Before we continue, subscribe and smash the like button. I had come to El Salvador knowing CECOT by its reputation. The Terrorism Confinement Center had become internationally known as the centerpiece of the country's aggressive war on gangs. I expected a maximum security prison. High walls, armed guards, locked doors. I was not prepared for the scale. The facility was built to hold tens of thousands of prisoners. More than 40,000 people could potentially be confined within one massive complex. Even before I reached the inmate areas, the design seemed to explain the philosophy behind the place. Everything existed to control movement. One barrier led to another. Access was restricted. Observation was constant. Then I reached the prisoners. That was when my first assumption began to fall apart. With rival gang members concentrated inside one enormous prison, I had expected constant tension and violence. Instead, I saw something different. The system itself had become the dominant force. Prisoners moved when instructed. They sat where they were directed. Their bodies were monitored, and their space tightly controlled. The gangs that had once exercised power over neighborhoods outside these walls were now inside an environment where almost every decision had been taken out of their hands. I kept thinking about that contrast. These were men connected to organizations that had once spread fear across communities. Some had been linked to murder and other violent crimes. Some had reportedly admitted to taking numerous lives. But behind layers of security, the image was no longer of powerful men controlling territory. It was of men who had been contained. Then I began to understand what life inside CECOT could actually mean. This was not a prison built around comfort. The cells were crowded. Privacy was almost non-existent. Prisoners lived under strict routines and constant monitoring. But what struck me even more was their separation from the outside world. For many people, prison still leaves room for connection. A visit from a parent, a conversation with a child, a few moments with someone waiting outside. Inside CECOT, that connection was far more limited. Family visits were not part of the ordinary routine I had imagined. The separation was not just physical. The outside world could begin to feel increasingly distant. That made me think about something I had not considered before entering. What happens when the organization that once defined someone's entire life loses its power? But the consequences of belonging to it remain. I had expected the story inside CECOT to be mostly about crime. Instead, another layer began to emerge. Loss. Gang life had not only taken lives from victims and communities. For some of the men inside, it had also destroyed their own connection to family, opportunity, and any future beyond the criminal world. Some prisoners had reportedly reflected on the number of people they had killed. The figures were horrifying. Hearing claims that some individuals had taken dozens of lives forced me to confront why a prison like this had been created. It was easy to focus on the men behind the bars. It was much harder to ignore the people who were no longer alive because of the violence that had brought men like these into the system. That changed the way I saw CECOT. At first, I had been focused almost entirely on what was happening to the prisoners. Then I began thinking about the people who had lived outside under the shadow of gang violence, families who had lost relatives, businesses that had been threatened, communities where people changed their routines because certain streets belonged to certain groups, people who had spent years organizing their lives around fear. Suddenly, the story inside CECOT became connected to a much larger story outside it. But that connection created another question. If CECOT represented the removal of gang power from the streets, what happened to men who had spent years believing that their gang identity was everything? Inside the prison, those identities still existed, but their power had changed. Outside, gang membership could bring status, territory, weapons, money, and influence. Inside CECOT, those things appeared to mean very little. The prison had stripped away the environment that once allowed these organizations to dominate. And that may have been one of the most unsettling things I witnessed. Not because I forgot the crimes associated with many of these men. What unsettled me was seeing how completely a life could be reduced to confinement. I began to understand why CECOT had attracted so much attention. This was not simply a prison built to hold criminals, it was a statement. Every wall, gate, and layer of security appeared to communicate the same message. The people confined here were not supposed to regain control of the society they had once terrorized. But another contradiction became impossible to ignore. The more secure the prison appeared, the more isolated its prisoners became. These were men who had once belonged to groups built around loyalty. Yet that loyalty had not given many of them freedom, family, or a future, only confinement. And still, I could not escape the question that had followed me from the moment I stepped inside. Could a place like this actually erase the power of gangs? Or could it only contain the people who once carried that power? CECOT could hold enormous numbers of prisoners. Its security was designed to make escape extraordinarily difficult. Its restrictions could separate inmates from the outside world. But a prison could not erase history. It could not bring back the people who had been killed. It could not restore the years communities had lost to fear. And it could not automatically answer what happens to a society after the men who once dominated its streets are locked behind steel and concrete. As I left, the image that stayed with me was not the walls, the guards, or even the scale of the prison. It was the silence of power disappearing. Men who had once been feared were now part of a system where almost nothing belonged to them. Their families were outside. Their former territories were outside. The lives they had once influenced were continuing without them. But one question stayed with me. If CECOT is meant to ensure that the power of these gangs never returns, what happens to the men inside when the organization that once defined their entire existence becomes irrelevant? Do they remain loyal to an identity that no longer gives them anything? Do they regret what they became? Or does confinement simply preserve the consequences of a life that had already been destroyed long before they entered these walls? That is the part I still think about. What do you think? Is CECOT the ultimate answer to gang violence? Or is there a deeper problem that prison walls alone can never solve? Share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more unbelievable journeys into places that challenge everything we think we know.